They shut down a multi-million-dollar golf course tee box because of 4 trees. My 4 trees. 3 weeks after they cut them down without my permission, the county rolled in with inspectors. Investors started asking uncomfortable questions, and the same executive who smiled at me like I was just another obstacle showed up on my front porch asking what it would take to make this whole thing go away. Funny thing is, none of it started with lawyers or shouting or some years-long feud between neighbors. It started because a handful of people with expensive watches and bigger egos looked at something that belonged to me and decided their profits mattered more than my property. My name is Ethan Brooks, and until all of this happened, I lived a pretty quiet life outside a little town called Ashford Ridge in Kentucky. I'd owned my place for almost 10 years. It wasn't some mansion with iron gates or a picture-perfect farmhouse you'd see on television. It was just a comfortable house tucked against the edge of an old golf course, the kind of place where evenings were slow and people still waved for pickup trucks. Everyone who came over assumed the best thing about my property was the golf course behind it. But honestly, they couldn't have been more wrong. The reason I bought that house wasn't the fairway, it wasn't the location, and it definitely wasn't because I care about golf. It was the line of enormous white oak trees stretching across the back of my property. Those trees were older than I was. They shaded my deck in the summer, blocked the wind during winter, and gave me something that's becoming harder to find these days: privacy. Every evening after work, I'd pour myself a bourbon, sit outside in an old wooden chair that creaked every time I leaned back, and watch the sunlight filter through those branches. Sometimes deer wandered along the tree line. Sometimes I'd hear nothing except birds and the breeze moving through the leaves. You don't realize how attached you become to something like that until somebody takes it away. For years, the golf course belonged to a local family. They minded their business, I minded mine, and that was the end of it. Then one spring, everything changed. A development company called Summit Crest Holdings bought the course along with hundreds of acres surrounding it. Within weeks, construction crews showed up everywhere. The old clubhouse disappeared behind scaffolding. Heavy equipment rolled across the fairways from sunrise until dark, and giant billboards appeared advertising luxury golf estates, executive living, and championship amenities. Suddenly, there were engineers, consultants, architects, and black SUVs driving around like they owned the county. Maybe they thought they did. One afternoon, I was fixing a loose fence post when one of those SUVs pulled into my driveway. Out stepped a man named Gavin Mercer. Crisp polo shirt, polished boots, expensive sunglasses, and the kind of smile that looked like he'd practiced it in front of a mirror before every meeting. He introduced himself as the development director, shook my hand like we were old friends, complimented my property, asked about the weather. Then, after maybe 5 minutes, he looked past me toward the trees. Right then, I knew exactly where the conversation was headed. He said they were building a signature tee box behind my property, one that would become the highlight of the entire course. Future homeowners would love the panoramic view. Golfers would remember it forever. Investors were excited. I listened politely because that's how I was raised. Then he cleared his throat and said, "The only challenge is that your tree line blocks most of that view." I actually laughed because I honestly thought he was joking. "Those trees are on my property," I told him. He nodded without missing a beat. "Of course they are. We completely understand that. We're just wondering if you'd be open to discussing a mutually beneficial solution." I hate that phrase. Every time someone says mutually beneficial, what they usually mean is they're about to benefit a whole lot more than you are. I smiled back, pointed toward the trees, and said, "My solution is pretty simple. They stay." For just a second, his smile slipped. It wasn't dramatic, just enough for me to notice. Then he thanked me for my time, climbed back into his SUV, and drove away. The whole conversation lasted maybe 15 minutes, but something about it stayed with me. I couldn't explain why. Maybe it was how confident he sounded before I'd even answered. Maybe it was the feeling that he'd already decided how this story was supposed to end. Whatever it was, every time I looked toward those trees over the next couple of weeks, I found myself wondering if that conversation was really over or if it had only just begun. The answer came sooner than I expected. That Friday, my younger sister called and asked if I could help her move into a new place about 3 hours away. I left before sunrise with a truck full of moving blankets, and the kind of optimism every person has before they remember how heavy couches actually are. By the time I got home late Sunday night, my back felt 20 years older. I barely had enough energy to unload my overnight bag, and all I wanted was a hot shower and a few hours of sleep. Monday morning started like every other Monday. I wandered into the kitchen half awake, poured myself a cup of coffee, and glanced through the back window while waiting for it to cool. Something looked different. At first, I couldn't put my finger on it. The yard seemed brighter somehow, almost wider, like somebody had turned up the lights overnight. Then my brain caught up with my eyes, and the coffee cup slipped right out of my hand. It shattered across the kitchen floor, but I barely heard it. I was already running toward the back door. The moment I stepped onto the deck, my stomach dropped. Four of my biggest white oaks were gone. Not trimmed, not damaged by a storm. Gone. Fresh stumps sat in the dirt with pale wood still exposed, surrounded by piles of sawdust that hadn't even had time to blow away. Through the gap I could see straight across the golf course, and sitting perfectly centered in that opening was the brand new elevated tee box Gavin had told me about. The view was exactly what he'd wanted. It was my view. For a long moment, I just stood there staring, almost waiting for my eyes to correct themselves. Those trees had survived storms that ripped roofs off houses around here. They'd been standing decades before I bought the property. I'd celebrated birthdays under those branches, grilled burgers with friends there, watched my dad sit in that same chair after he retired. You don't replace memories like that with a landscaping crew. Then the shock burned into something much hotter. I climbed into my truck and drove straight toward the maintenance yard behind the course. My coffee was still dripping off the kitchen floor. And honestly, that was the least expensive thing someone was going to regret that day. A few workers were loading chainsaws into a trailer when I pulled in. I walked right up to them and asked, "Who cut the trees behind my property?" The men looked at each other before one finally answered. "We did." He said it the same way somebody might admit to mowing a lawn. I pointed back toward my house. Those trees were on my land. The color drained from his face. Another worker quietly set down the chainsaw he'd been carrying. Nobody looked comfortable anymore. Finally, one of them muttered, "We were told they were part of the cleanup along the boundary." "Who told you that?" I asked. Silence. Then another man rubbed the back of his neck and said, "Management signed the work order." I looked at those guys for another few seconds before turning around. They weren't the villains here. They were following instructions. Whoever had signed that order was the one I intended to deal with. That evening, my dining room table disappeared under stacks of paperwork. Property surveys, deeds, tax records, closing documents, inspection reports, anything that had my address on it came out of storage. Around midnight, my neighbor, Carl, wandered over after noticing every light in my house still on. Carl had lived next door longer than anybody else on our road. He listened quietly while I explained what happened, then looked over the papers spread across the table. "You already know those trees were yours," he said. I nodded. "Yeah, I just need proof that nobody can argue with." The next morning, I called a surveyor named Daniel Harper. Around our county, people joked that Daniel knew property lines better than most people knew their own birthdays. 2 days later, he arrived with a crew carrying tripods, GPS equipment, old county maps, and enough measuring gear to make it look like NASA had parked in my backyard. I watched from my deck while they spent hours checking historical markers, comparing surveys, measuring distances, and driving stakes into the ground. Every minute felt like an hour. Finally, Daniel walked toward me, carrying a clipboard. "Well," I asked before he even reached the deck. He grinned slightly. "Depends whether you're asking as a homeowner or somebody looking for an argument." "Both." He laughed. "Every single stump sits well inside your property line. Not inches. Several feet. Whoever approved this either never checked the survey or decided it didn't matter." Hearing those words changed everything. Until then, I'd been angry. Now I was certain. Daniel's crew installed bright orange survey stakes along the entire property line, making it impossible for anyone to pretend there had been confusion. Carl wandered over again that evening and stared at the markers stretching across my backyard. "They're in trouble," he said quietly. "Maybe," I answered, "but I don't think I've figured out the whole story yet." Most people probably would have hired an attorney right then, and believe me, I considered it. I even spoke to one over the phone, but something kept nagging at me. Companies that spend tens of millions developing luxury communities don't usually gamble everything over 4 trees, unless those trees are standing in the way of something much bigger. So instead of filing a lawsuit first, I started digging. Every night after work, I sat in front of my computer searching through county planning records, zoning applications, environmental reports, permit packages, and public meeting minutes. The deeper I looked, the stranger the whole project became. This wasn't just a golf course renovation. Summit Crest Holdings was selling exclusivity. Their marketing promised breathtaking views, premium amenities, and carefully designed landscapes. Investors expected deadlines. Buyers expected perfection. Those 4 trees weren't just trees anymore. They were obstacles between the company and millions of dollars in future sales. Then, almost by accident, I found one sentence buried deep inside a permit package that made me stop reading and start smiling. It mentioned an existing mature tree buffer separating the golf course from neighboring residential properties. I read it again, then a third time. Suddenly, every piece of the puzzle started falling into place. That single sentence changed everything. Up until then, I thought I was dealing with a company that had crossed a property line because it was convenient. Now it looked like they had crossed a legal line that could put their entire project at risk. The more I read through the county documents, the clearer it became. The mature tree buffer behind my property wasn't just landscaping. It had been included in the approved site plan as both a visual screen and a safety barrier separating golfers from nearby homes. Without it, the course no longer matched the conditions under which it had been approved. I leaned back in my chair, looked out the window at the empty space where those trees had stood for decades, and laughed to myself. Not because it was funny, but because for the first time since this whole mess started, I realized I wasn't the one with the biggest problem anymore. The next morning, I called the county planning office. The woman who answered sounded polite, but understandably cautious. I'm sure she hears complaints every day from neighbors convinced the world is out to get them. I calmly explained what had happened, told her about the survey results, and then referenced the permit condition regarding the tree buffer. There was a brief pause before she asked, "Do you have documentation?" I looked over at the stack of papers covering half my dining room table and smiled. More than you'll probably want to read. Over the next several days, I submitted everything. Survey reports, property records, photographs showing the fresh stumps, older pictures proving the trees had existed long before construction ever began, copies of the approved permits with the highlighted language about the buffer zone. I wasn't accusing anyone of anything. I simply asked the county to review the information and determine whether the project still complied with its approval. Then came the hardest part, waiting. Construction continued every day as if nothing had happened. Dump trucks rolled in before sunrise. Landscapers planted flowers near the clubhouse. Golf carts carried potential buyers around the property, while sales representatives pointed toward the brand-new signature tee box like it was the crown jewel of the development. Meanwhile, I sat on my deck looking through a gap that never should have existed. About 10 days later, 2 county vehicles pulled onto the service road behind my house. I happened to be home that afternoon, so I grabbed a folding chair, poured myself a glass of sweet tea, and watched from the deck. I won't lie, it was probably the most satisfying glass of tea I've ever had. The inspectors spent hours measuring distances, comparing survey markers, reviewing maps, and photographing every single stump from multiple angles. Then one of them walked onto the new tee box, while another asked if I'd mind, standing near my patio. I had no idea what they were checking until the inspector on the tee box pointed toward my yard. Without those trees, there was a completely open line between golfers and my backyard. One inspector mimicked the path of a golf swing, while the other nodded and scribbled notes on a clipboard. Suddenly it clicked. By removing my trees, they hadn't just improved the view. They had eliminated the very barrier that helped keep golf balls from reaching residential property. They had solved one problem for themselves and accidentally created another one that was even worse. Government agencies tend to take safety pretty seriously. A week later, the county made its decision. The signature tee box received an immediate stop-use order pending corrective action and compliance review. In plain English, it was shut down. Completely. No golfers. No promotional photos. No grand opening events. The expensive centerpiece of Summit Crest's luxury development became an empty platform surrounded by caution signs. Word spread through town faster than I expected. Some people thought I had overreacted. Others said the company deserved every bit of it. Carl walked over one evening, looked toward the silent tea box, and simply said, "Guess they should have left your trees alone." 3 days later, a familiar black SUV pulled into my driveway. Gavin stepped out looking nothing like the confident executive I'd met weeks earlier. His perfect smile had disappeared, replaced by tired eyes and the expression of someone who hadn't slept much. We sat on my deck, facing the empty space where the trees had once stood. After a long silence, he cleared his throat. "There seems to have been a misunderstanding." I couldn't help laughing. 4 80-year-old trees don't disappear because of a misunderstanding. He ignored the comment and slid several landscaping sketches across the table. Small ornamental trees, decorative shrubs, fresh mulch, the cheapest possible solution packaged inside glossy presentation folders. "These will grow over time," he said. I looked at the drawings, then back at the stumps. "Eventually, maybe around the time my grandchildren retire." His jaw tightened. For the first time since we'd met, he realized I wasn't interested in making this easy. After another long silence, he finally asked the question he'd been avoiding all afternoon. "What exactly do you want?" I had already prepared my answer. I reached into a folder beside my chair and handed him an estimate from a company that specialized in relocating mature trees. Not little saplings. Full-sized white oaks capable of restoring the buffer within weeks instead of decades. Gavin's eyebrows climbed higher with every page he turned. "You're serious?" he asked. "Completely. This is going to cost a fortune." I shrugged. "So does cutting down somebody else's property?" Before he could respond, I handed him a second document. This one came directly from the county. Because the safety buffer no longer existed, I had the legal right to construct a protective barrier along my rear property line if I chose to. A tall one, nearly 20 feet high, completely within my rights. Gavin slowly lowered the paper and stared toward the golf course. Even from where we sat, it was obvious what that wall would do. The million-dollar view his company had destroyed my trees to create would disappear overnight behind a giant legal barrier. The irony hung in the air between us. They had cut down my trees for a better view, and now they were staring at the possibility of a wall twice as tall. 3 days later, Gavin returned, this time with company attorneys instead of landscaping brochures. Summit Crest Holdings agreed to pay for the relocation of mature trees, cover every restoration expense, comply with every county requirement, and complete the work under county supervision. A few weeks later, enormous trucks rolled into the neighborhood, carrying towering white oaks with root systems wrapped in massive burlap bundles. Half the neighborhood came outside to watch because it looked more like a movie set than a landscaping project. It wasn't perfect. You can't replace decades of growth overnight. But when the last tree was secured and I sat back down in my old wooden chair, the yard finally felt like home again. Eventually, the county approved the corrective work, lifted the stop-use order, and the tee box reopened. Life moved on, but every time I look toward that golf course, I'm reminded that respect costs almost nothing, while arrogance can become unbelievably expensive. So now I'd like to hear from you. If you were standing in my shoes, would you have accepted a simple cash settlement and walked away, or would you have fought for full restoration the way I did? Let me know in the comments, because stories like this always spark strong opinions. And if you've ever dealt with neighbors, developers, an HOA, or anyone who believed money gave them the right to ignore your property or your voice, share your story too. Don't forget to like the video, subscribe to the channel, and I'll see you in the next one.